Alan, thank you so much for coming on the Easy Pray podcast today.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Can you give myself and the audience a little bit of background about who you are and what you do?
Sure. My name is Alan Castel. I'm a professor of cognitive psychology at the University of California, Los Angeles. My main areas of interest for research is studying memory and how it changes with age, and how factors might make us susceptible to scams and fraud.
That's really cool. It sounds like we're going to have a great discussion today. It's kind of right up my alley. How long have you been studying out how memory and aging affects our susceptibility?
Well, I've had an interest in this when I had older grandparents. I think that's where it all got started. And I noticed, they would sometimes confuse my name with my brother's name, but they could still remember how much they paid for gas or groceries. So I noticed certain changes in their memories, and same with my parents, and now even my own memory. So I think I've been studying it for a long time, but I was fortunate to find this research path and have been studying it, for 20 years now at UCLA. I was a postdoc at Washington University in St. Louis, and I received my PhD from the University of Toronto. So that explains this Canadian accent that I still seem to have a little bit.
It's very subtle. No one would notice it if you don't mention it.
Okay.
Uh, was it because of your grandparents that really got you interested in this, or is that just kind of an aside?
That's a bit of an anecdote. I think when I noticed those changes, I didn't know people studied this, and I wasn't thinking professionally. But in high school, I memorized things to do well on tests. Like I memorized the entire periodic table, and I did this not because I had a good memory, but because I made up mnemonics, rhymes, or used imagery to remember things that I didn't really care about or understand, but I needed to know for a test. And it was only in my first year of college that I knew that, they took this psychology course and it opened up this whole area. I always thought of psychology as studying, clinical psychology, but this whole area of experimental psychology that looked at how we learn, how we remember, why we forget. And I was hooked. I mean, I felt like I'd been doing this already for 10 years, playing with my own memory. So it's really interesting to study how memory works. False memory, why we don't always remember things the way we think we will. Eyewitness memory. So I've been doing a lot of work on, just the malleability of memory and how it changes with age.
Oh, we could go down a deep rabbit hole on the malleability of memory. That I would love to have that conversation with you at some point, but that's not what we're talking about today. So how does we'll kind of talk on the broad level first? How does aging affect our susceptibility towards scams?
Well, I think broadly speaking, we're all susceptible to scams. I think we have the stereotype that older adults are prone to scams or are gullible, are lonely. But the truth is there's scam out there for everyone. And I think that should get people aware that these scams are not specifically targeting you or me or older people. They're broad-based, going after a bunch of people. They work on large numbers. So that, there's call centers, there's emails, there's all sorts of things. But there are scams that are then tailored towards, specific, groups. And sometimes it's people who are lonely, people who are looking for romance. I mean, people who are looking for money. We're all looking for
Yeah.
money. We all have, but older adults have often more assets, so they have more to lose. And I think that's
Mhm.
why it's concerning that, if an older adult is engaged and gets scammed, it can be shameful. A lot of older adults will not report that they've been scammed because they're ashamed. And often if they tell their adult children say, oh, look what's happening to mom or dad. We have to be careful with them. We might have to take over power of attorney. So it's an underreported thing. And I think that that's part of it, is that we need to be more aware that this happens to everyone, and it happens to smart people. It happens to lonely people. It happens to, very, very aware people. It probably can happen to you and me on any given day.
Yeah.
So we have to be on our toes. And so that's why I think it's a problem and something we should all be aware of, and something we should be talking about more, that it's not something that you should be ashamed of. It's something that you should, if it's happened to you, you should tell people. If it's almost happened to you, you should tell people, because chances are they'll be able to have a similar conversation or say that happened to a friend of mine. And the more we talk about it, the more we're aware that these things exist.
So let's unpack kind of that shame and embarrassment angle. Why are humans, I don't want to say controlled by shame, but why is that seems to be such a powerful state that prevents us from doing stuff?
Well, I think scams focus on our human nature of trying to make sense of the world and our emotional brain. A lot of these scams are preying on very basic emotions that we all have. A need to connect, a need to gain, a need to understand the world. And so, if we work it at that level, I think we're all in this position to be to make money, to be curious, and all of these things can also have a dark side to them. And that's where scammers exploit this very basic human nature. And I think when it happens to us, we then think, oh my gosh, how could have this happened? Or, it started out so friendly, or I thought I knew this person. And as a result, we think it just could only, it could only have happened to me, like, gosh, I started down this hole and it was because of me that I kept talking on the phone. And oftentimes scammers will target things that, we all have vulnerabilities. So, there's a recent case with therapists who were, the scammer called and said, you've missed jury duty. This is a common one. And your license can be revoked if you've missed jury duty and you're a therapist. Now, I'm not sure that's true, but it's going to get a therapist very concerned that
Hmm.
their reputation is on the line and maybe they have missed jury duty. They don't know. And now they've started like, I need to protect myself. What can I do to get out of this problem? And if you think very rationally, it's like, what do I need to do to fix this? And the scammer is very quick to say, well, listen, I can help you. And that's another kind of basic property of our brain is we're trying to solve puzzles all the time and make sense of things. So these are very intelligent people who want to help people, and they get caught up in this sort of thing. So it's tailor-made really to expose our vulnerabilities.
Interesting. One of the things that you mentioned is kind of exploiting our intelligence. I think one of the common thoughts behind scams is, and I'm going to be blunt or mean depending on how you choose to look at it, is the people that fall victim fall victims to scams, that they're not smart people, they're dumb. When the evidence seems to be a little bit not that way, correct?
Yeah, the evidence is quite interesting in terms of, if you use level of formal education as a metric for, intelligence, which it certainly isn't always. But oftentimes people who have a high degree of formal education are very prone to scams because they use a lot of logic to think through why this timeshare they're being presented might actually make sense. And mathematically, they've been selected because they visit Mexico frequently. So, these scammers are often well prepared. They come with good data and they know your profile sometimes too well. And especially if you're not aware of how they got this information, you might think, I've been selected for this. I'm a fortunate person. And that can lead you to do some things that you might not do if you took yourself out of that situation. So some of it is very situationally dependent. Another scam is on, timeshares where they'll call you and they know that you own a timeshare, and they'll say that that your timeshare is in demand right now, and they've noticed you haven't been using it frequently, and that maybe taxes haven't been paid as promptly, and then they'll give you some opportunity to sell this timeshare, which might be actually, or sell a portion of it, which might actually be something you've been contemplating for a
Hmm.
while. So now you see this as an opportunity. And it's almost like you don't want this opportunity to go away. And as a result, you've rationalized why you should stay on the phone. And some of these scammers, they just want you on the phone longer. That's another cautionary tale I tell people is sometimes people think they're too smart for these scammers. They like keeping them on the phone and chatting with them. They'll measure how long you stay on the phone for and record that and then sell your contact information. So just staying on the phone is actually a liability in terms of being called again, being marked as someone who might be interested, but didn't fall for it this time.
Is that an indicator of our vulnerability, the longer that we might spend on time on the phone with somebody? Just
It's hard to
even if it's
find.
not a scammer?
Yeah, it's hard to find these indicators necessarily. Now, some are, like loneliness or people who just answer the phone are going to be more vulnerable. Even if you have a landline, you might be more vulnerable. So just that's kind of the outlet to getting people is just how to contact them. And sometimes it's, text message. It depends on the generations. Different age people respond to different things. So our vulnerabilities are kind of, another one that was going around was student loans, right?
Hmm.
So the news, 6 months ago, 8 months ago, saying things like student loans can be, there might be an opportunity to get your student loans paid for. And now all of a sudden you're a student, you're hearing this, or you've had loans for 10 years, and now you're getting a phone call that sounds very relevant to what you've heard on the news. And as a result, you want to listen, right?
Hmm.
Because you don't know how they might be contacting you. Was it by mail? How are you going to get? And all of a sudden you're on the phone and you're interested in listening and hearing more. And they just need a little bit of information so they can, make sure your file is updated and correct. And you provide a little bit of information, and next thing you know, or maybe don't know, that
Yeah.
there's some identity theft going on. So sometimes you don't even know when it's happened. And I think that's another concerning thing. And again, these are, smart individuals, often recent college
Hmm.
grads who've, the stakes are sometimes lower for younger people. That's why it's not, in terms of the stats, we have this, stereotype that it's older people, because it's older people who can lose a lot more, where it's younger people who might get identity theft or lose a few $1,000s.
Yeah, I've heard of somewhat more recent studies indicating that the younger audience is actually more likely to be scammed, but the dollar amounts are smaller, where older populations are less likely to be scammed, but the dollar amounts are higher. And so there's kind of differences at both ends of the spectrum.
Absolutely. And it's a different type of scam. Sometimes it's a dollar amount, sometimes it's identity theft, which can be, as damaging for long term, if someone's using your identity. So yeah, you're right. And I think that's something to be aware of. These stereotypes that we have, that it's just older adults or older adults who might not understand technology or AI. It's actually all of us. And it's the right scam can certainly find you.
So we were talking a little bit about awareness. How much does awareness of scams and talking about scams with friends, family affect our ability to be scammed?
Yeah, I think it's, again, it's an underreported event when someone's scammed. We talked a little bit about the shame or embarrassment, but then the awareness can sometimes come from reading about it or hearing about it on the news, but sometimes it's from someone else who tells you, this happened to me or this almost happened to me, and that makes you aware of it. And I think, this is some research that we're interested in doing. Like, if someone shares something with you, you might think, oh, that's crazy. Like, Chris almost fell for that. That would never happen to me. And it's kind of the curse of knowledge. When you hear about a scam and you're on the outside looking in, you think that seems, it's a good scam, but I wouldn't have gone for it. But you're not in that emotional kind of state. And so we're trying to see, when people are in a more emotional state, or when they're told, how would you feel
Hmm.
if this happened to you? Then people might think, gosh, I would feel kind of frustrated or embarrassed, or I'd be confused, or I'd ask more questions. And these are all things that make you realize, wait a second, this could happen to me. And the thing about scams is they're so dynamic that just
Hmm.
because you've learned about the scam that happened last month or 3 months ago, that doesn't mean it's the scam that's going to get you in 3 months. It's going to be a different one, sometimes a variation, but sometimes a brand new one. So while scams will often prey on our very basic emotional needs, they're moving. They're fast paced, and they're keeping up with current events. So I think that's why it's hard to stay up to date with the latest scam.
Are there ways that we can kind of inoculate ourselves?
Yeah, I think, it's hard to be completely inoculated because it's always changing. But I think for the first part is just the contact. Like, the IRS will never be contacting you. It's hard to get in touch with the IRS, right? So if they're reaching out to you, you should be critical. And I think that's the first thing. I had older grandparents, again, when I think back, who would often talk on the phone, but I also heard them hang up the phone. They get a call and just hang up. And I was like, gosh, that sounded so rude when I was young. But now I understand it, and it's even more prevalent with AI, with using voices, using, orders that you recently made on Amazon. They have a lot of information on
Hmm.
you. And so I think the inoculation part is, sadly, like, you have to be wary of social media. What you're sharing online is going to be used by scammers. And this is another kind of common scam where, grandchildren might be traveling somewhere and they're sharing things on Instagram. And then the grandparent gets a phone call, and, the phone call is saying, your daughter's in trouble. She's, we need bail money. And you hear her in the background, and then she says, Grandpa, don't call mom and dad, just send the money. And it sounds like something horrible has happened. And this
Hmm.
is, this makes use of very, well-known psychological research that older adults want to help. They want to help their immediate family, and especially if they're told, don't tell mom and dad. I'm reaching out to you because you're special and I trust you. All of a sudden, you want to work fast and quickly. You want to protect
Hmm.
your family. And so that was a scam that's going around, and it's only going to get more convincing with AI and kind of using use of familiar voices. So it's a concerning thing, and so like I say, don't answer the phone. Be cautious of emails, but you will get phone calls that sound very compelling, and it's not. I've done some work as an expert witness on why we might be contacted. And some of these things are things as simple as like a free magazine subscription,
Hmm.
which sounds, like it's a free magazine subscription and, you get to choose up to 4 magazines. And this was not targeting, older people. This was targeting often receptionists at doctors' offices where, you might be making some decisions for your business. And this sounds reasonable and you need magazines, but what you're not told, at least initially, is that the price of shipping is exorbitant.
Yeah.
$7 a magazine, you've ordered 5 magazines every month, and all of a sudden you're getting a bill. And the bill is for this shipping charge, and you're thinking shipping for, I thought these were free magazines, and well, the magazine's free, but the shipping isn't. And you just, you're not really paying attention to that sort of thing. So that's not a scam that's like, rushing you or putting you in an emotional state. It's just, they just keep mentioning free and you're distracted and busy and doing a few other things. And all of a sudden you're getting these bills that you're not sure, why am I paying this? How much longer am I going to be paying this? So that was an interesting and concerning scam that, is still circulating. And it blurs the border of what is a scam versus what is an offer that's kind of too good to be
Yeah.
true. And I agreed to it, but I didn't know the full terms. So scams are not always, these things that just sound crazy and end up being a complete scam. Sometimes it's people trying to take advantage of you.
Yeah, there's a there's a fine line between, or can be a fine line between deceptive marketing and scams. With the deceptive marketing, you're getting the product. It might not have been exactly what you were expecting or at the price that you were expecting, but there was a product. And the frauds are usually,
Well,
we're
yeah, and you agree to these things.
yeah.
We've also done another study, and this relates to more of the memory research we do, that, there's a lot of products that will say they're clinically studied. And if you have a poor memory and you see this product and it has a bottle or an advertisement, it sounds like it's scientifically backed and clinically studied, you think, okay, this works. And the truth is, people misremember phrases like clinically studied as clinically proven,
Yeah.
because that's the more common phrasing that we'd expect. And sometimes our expectations really shape what we'll remember, what we want to think. And not everything is regulated by FDA or needs to be. These phrases are, they just sound sciency, and that's kind of how we remember it. And so that's
I,
another, instance where our brain is kind of playing a trick on us. Again, we're trying to make sense of the world. What does it mean, clinically studied? I mean, does it mean that they're currently studying it, or they studied it but didn't find anything, but they still studied it? So I think, we have to be cautious. We have to be critical. I always tell people to kind of take your time. There's usually not a rush, even though a lot of these offers will say it's a limited time offer,
Mhm.
or we're targeting you because your timeshare is, one that's in demand right now. If you hang up the phone and say, I'm happy to receive more information in writing, or, let me think about it, let me talk to my immediate family. So I think that's the biggest thing, is get off the phone.
Yeah, I think that I like your clinically studied reference in that there's science. Well, yeah, we did a clinical study and it proved our product doesn't work, but we're not going to
Right.
tell you that.
Exactly. And so testimonies are often, I think, important. So if people can share, they've been scammed or fraud, that can be helpful. But there's a lot of hurdles out there to get over. And some of these things work on, again, trying to rush people. You have a computer
Hmm.
virus, will immediately, shut down everything, and you're not maybe super computer literate. And so now all of a sudden this message on your screen is giving you some support, tech support that can help you. And you think, oh, great, we can solve this problem. And, they're only charging $19.99. Well, that seems reasonable. And but they're not. They're taking your credit card information, and it's not, it's a scam, it's a fraud. But by the time you've fixed your computer and sat back for a second, you realize, wait a second, I just gave my credit card to a group I don't know anything about.
Yeah. That's the scary thing. Uh, are there techniques that we can use to help people overcome the shame and embarrassment and increase reporting?
Yeah, there's definitely websites that are reputable that are looking for you to report scams so they can keep up with it, like the Federal Trade Commission, AARP has some good support. And so I think it's helpful to talk about these things. And yes, sometimes you're concerned about talking to family or even friends about it, but I think that's the first step. And I think it helps people understand how it can happen to anyone. And a lot of times when you start sharing something, I like doing this in my classes at UCLA. I'll share some scam or something, and inevitably a few hands will come up and they'll say, "Oh, that happened to my mother-in-law," or "That happened to my father or my grandparent." But then people start saying, "Oh, that happened to me." And these are younger people who are trying to buy concert tickets on Ticketmaster, and then they tried to find cheaper tickets somewhere. And before they knew it, these are smart people who are, all of a sudden on websites they're not familiar with, entering credit card information or paying by PayPal and so on. So I think that's the first step is kind of acknowledging it can happen to anyone. It happens to smart people. It happens to people who are, really just focused on getting what they want. And, it's preying on our very basic nature.
So I'll ask you a question I usually ask guests in this with similar backgrounds to you, and unfortunately, I didn't ask you this question before we started the recording, so we'll get the live response. Have you ever been a victim of a scam or nearly been a victim of a scam?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen it happen to other people, and I've been nearly a victim to the similar scams where I've realized it happened. And then I've also been a victim where, yeah, I've entered credit card information on websites that I shouldn't have. And it was usually because I've been hunting for something for a long time.
Hmm.
And finally I saw a better price, and I quickly backtracked, and it was probably too late, but I canceled my credit card, and I felt stupid. I felt
Hmm.
like this is the kind of thing that, if I, in my right mind, I'd be like, why was I coveting this item, or why was I going after this for so long? And so, yeah, I've experienced that shame and guilt, and luckily it didn't result in, a monetary loss, but it resulted in a lot of inconvenience.
Hmm.
And I've come close when I've received things in the mail or followed up on things. And I think part of it, at least in my case, is this sense of curiosity that I'm
Yeah.
really interested in how scams work, but I'm also just curious in general. So that has led us to, some of the studies we've been doing now to look at if a sense of curiosity is also related to scam susceptibility. And it's kind of a slippery question because it depends
Hmm.
on what kind of curiosity you're talking about. Because curiosity is a good thing. It's something that keeps us going. It keeps your brain sharp. But it's like Pandora's box. You need to know what sort of thing you're opening up. And so, yes, I'm happy to share more details of how I've been scammed or near scammed, but I've also excited to hear other people reveal that they've been
Hmm.
scammed. So that's, I think, part of the research program that we're interested in is looking at how people can use something called self-reference, right? Because just like you're saying, we can talk about scams abstractly, but you want to know, has it happened to you? Because if
Yeah.
I share that, as people might be like, okay, this guy is not, he's just like one of us or everyone else. And so I think it's important. And that's why older adults probably feel shame because they think their younger counterparts are not getting scammed. And
Hmm.
if they reveal this, they'll look like they're susceptible. But it's usually a different kind of scam that's going to, attract an older adult. And some of the scams are also romance scams that some people who are, obviously in committed relationships might not be interested in, whereas
Yeah.
other people might seek that out. That's something that even if they know it's a scam, sometimes they're like, but I enjoyed the conversation, or this person really seemed to care about me. I knew it didn't seem, like it was sincere all the time.
Yeah.
So in the back of their heads, that's, another type of scam. Sometimes, some of them are very convincing, but that's another blurry line where I think, there is this basic human need for connection.
Yeah. I can see how that could be exploited if someone is in a vulnerable state. If they're looking for a connection and someone offers that connection, it can seem very real, or I don't want to say convenient, but great. This meets a need that I currently have.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of it is it works on a reinforcement schedule too. It's like you might get some reinforcement throughout the scam. So not all scams are quick and they take your money and it's gone. Some of these scams, they call them pig butchering, where they kind of
Hmm.
butter you up for a while and even allow you to make some investment or get some return on money. And so you see that, it's working. You gave them $2,000 and, a couple of days later, all of a sudden it's up to $6,000. So it sounds legitimate. And then they're like, okay, let's go for a little more, and you realize, well, I made money the first time. This seems like, a legitimate thing, or I can trust this person. And trust is a big thing here.
Hmm.
But you're really, entering dangerous waters.
Yeah, I'm starting to hear more and more about people talking about scams where there's, let's just call it a romance scam. The context of the scam is not necessarily relevant, where the person borrows money from them and then they pay it back. Now, usually it's not them paying it back, it's some other victim who's, they're a big circle cross wire, wiring money to different accounts.
Yeah.
But that builds so much trust in the target of like, well, they can't be a scammer because they paid me back this small amount. And
Yeah.
then the number just gets bigger and bigger and bigger over time. And then the repayment doesn't happen.
Yeah. And so that's, in psychological terms, this is like a reinforcement schedule that, as you get reinforced a few times, you're building trust, or you at least maybe you were skeptical initially, so you started with a small amount, but now you have some evidence. So it's like, you built up some relationship, you see some kind of something that makes sense to you, and then you don't want to lose out on an opportunity. So,
Hmm.
I always say scammers are like, I don't want to say psychologists, but they're like amateur psychologists in the wild. They're not interested in publishing papers and making great discoveries. They're interested in using some very simple psychological principles to make people part with their money.
Yeah. Are there any recent trends or cases that you're like, oh, I really want to talk about this new trend or this case that just came out?
There's so many interesting things that I'm learning about, and that so I think it's hard to stay an expert in this field. I always say, it comes down to some pretty basic, psychological principles. So that's why I try and not educate people on those, but
Hmm.
remind people that we're all human. We all have this drive to connect, to be curious, to be interested. And I think every time I see a new scam, I always think, wow, that's a clever one. It falls into, I could see that working because of these principles. So
Hmm.
I think as an academic, I like to categorize things or see. And so I'm not sure I see them as like, oh yeah, that's a brand new scam that, oh my gosh, how does that even work?
Hmm.
After a few minutes of thinking about it or looking at transcripts, and sometimes I get involved with these things as an expert witness, you can start to see the trend and say this is just a variation on a theme. And then, yes, it's using Bitcoin, but before we were using mail order catalogs, or before that, people have been scammed since, probably the beginning of time. I mean, it's a very, and so even though, yeah, I think the technology aspect has made this so much more accessible, just like
Hmm.
everything. And it's great to have the internet and email and so on. But it used to be mostly by telephone, and then it used to be by mail. And so I think it's just the prevalence is so much greater, and scammers work on volume. They're
Yeah.
going to call 50,000 people in a day, and they only need a few responses to make money. So um, I think it's just a numbers game, and that numbers game has been drastically enhanced by technology, and it's been assisted by social media. I mean, we're
Yeah.
sharing a lot of information voluntarily. And so it used to be, scammers would crack into something and get your information, and that's concerning, but now our information is just there for the taking. And some of it seems
You're yelling it
innocuous.
from the mountaintops.
Sure, yeah, like just having your resume online. These are things you want to have out there, but all of a sudden some stranger knows a lot about you, and as a result, you're going to become engaged when they contact you.
I think one of the things that scares me is with advances in AI. Not that AI is inherently bad or good or anything like that, but that it just becomes a force multiplier for scammers. In that,
Yeah.
if I don't need to have 500 scammers working in a call center, I can have a one computer with an AI voice pretending to be 10,000 people in a call center. The scalability of this stuff becomes enormous and quite troubling.
Yeah, and I think you're right. Again, it's the volume issue that they can work on volume, and now the volume is just increased. And so I think that's why a lot of research now is looking at, not is AI human, but does it pass a Turing test? Does it
Yeah.
pass this? How can we determine if something's legitimate versus not? And you've probably had work with some chat bots or something where you're like talking to them for some, maybe marketing reason. And you just have this feeling like this is not a human behind here. I'm providing them some information, but if I was talking to a human, they'd be questioning or asking this.
Yeah.
And so I hope we can still be able to differentiate that, or just decide that, talking to a human might be beneficial, but, they're also, people are just trying to get your data. And sometimes it's to help you to make an informed medical decision. AI is going to influence, so many good things out there, but using it in a socially responsible way is going to be the next ethical question.
Are we gonna? Anytime that we get phone calls, are we gonna start doing the Blade Runner questionings? I'm dating
Yeah.
myself there, but
Yeah, and at some point it's a phone call that we answer, but at some point it'll just be something that's pinging us constantly, and we have to determine what's signal and what's noise, and what's family, what isn't, who do we trust. And so I think that trust issue is always going to be an important psychological aspect. And that's why I think it is related. When we talk about memory and aging, I think, that's something I've always been interested in, is like our memory is important for specific details sometimes. But sometimes it isn't, sometimes, so I ask people, this is like a question I've used for eyewitness memory, like, what the Apple logo looks like, right? Because you've seen it so many times, so you know what it looks like.
yeah.
But if I asked you more detailed questions, like is the bite on the left or right-hand side, you might struggle for a second and realize, wait a second, I thought I knew it, but I'm not sure. Is there a leaf or a stem? So now all of these details aren't quite as crystal clear in your mind, even though a minute ago you told me you knew this because you've seen it so many times. So our memory doesn't work like that. Just because we've seen something many times doesn't mean we remember it well. But we do have this kind of more gist-based memory, like I like using Apple products, or I trust this company. And I think as we get older, our memory becomes more gist-based. We might not remember all of these details, but we can remember, I hope, who we can trust. And usually, that's a family member, someone we have a relationship with. And those are kind of more emotionally based memories. And I think that's where scams kind of become interesting, because they're trying to put you in an emotional position where you have to question who you trust, what information are you accurately remembering, versus kind of hoping that this is the way that you would want to remember something. So I think that's kind of an interesting avenue for future research, looking at how we all remember. Even when you talk about how a scam went down, when you ask people, this is something I've been involved in as well, what is our recollection of the scam? It's not exactly the way it happened. We remember it in a selective manner, and sometimes it makes us look better or worse than but it often focuses on our feelings. At some point we're like, at some point something didn't seem right. It's like, well, at what point didn't it seem right, and why? How did you not know that initially? Or maybe you did, but you weren't following your feelings. And that's why, coming back to your question about level of education, sometimes people get into this analytic mode of how can I sell my timeshare or get rid of my jury duty record? And you're thinking kind of, how can I fix this problem using kind of the tools that are available to me, and this person is somehow helping me, and that can lead you into a lot of trouble.
Is it that we are hardwired into thinking people are there to help us as kind of a baseline?
Yeah, I think we like to be cooperative initially. I think it's hard if someone asks you a question. This is kind of very simple social psychology, the foot in the door technique. If someone asks you, how is your day? Or, is it raining outside? And it is. As soon as you respond with something positive or favorable, you're establishing this relationship with someone. And even though it's not like a deep relationship, you've answered a few questions for them, or you feel like you're helping them or they're helping you. And that's how people initially start these things. So that's why I say it's best to hang up the phone if you really, some people like to play around or talk to the person, and that can be like entertaining, but it can be dangerous. And I think, at the core of it's the same principles as like sales or marketing. You want the person to feel good, you want the person to get something that they need out of it,
Hmm.
and then it goes down some sort of other path where you're being taken advantage of.
Have you spent much time trying to play around with people on the phone, or just are you one? There was a period of time where I intentionally answered the calls that were caller ID blocked or a number I didn't know because I was curious about the scam, and at some point I was like, okay, this I'm not getting. They're
Yeah,
clearly able to figure out that I'm not a good mark or I'm not a mark for this particular scam and
yeah,
would hang up on me relatively quick before I could figure out what the scam was. But
yeah.
have you spent much time interacting with scammers to try to figure out what and how and why?
Well, I think it's a great question because it starts with often a phone call, and it can be, sometimes it's, it says scammer or something, but sometimes it's a phone number that looks familiar, and it
Hmm.
either looks familiar to your number or a number you call frequently. So you're like, wait, is this the dentist calling? I just called them. Maybe I should grab it. And then it's not, but then it sounds like someone else who might, be familiar, or you're like, no, this is probably a scam, but oh, they're talking about roofing. That's interesting. It just rained the other day, and that reminds me I do need to look for a roofer. So you're not engaging with the scam, but like I said, it's dangerous because they can be recording your voice. They can be selling simply the fact that you're answering the call. And but I think what's interesting is you use that word curious. And again, that's what it comes down to. And I think that's why sometimes even highly educated people are curious. And that level of curiosity can be beneficial for all sorts of things. But it can lead you into this direction that you're like, well, how did I get started on this? Well, I
Yeah.
was curious, right? And it's like a Pandora's box of you don't know what you're getting. Are you getting an opportunity to learn more about scammers and how they ask questions? And usually, you could play that game for a few minutes, but you have to ask yourself, if I was busier today, would I be doing this?
Yeah, that was what made me stop doing it. Is I don't have time to
Yeah,
to
and
play
I
these
once spoke
games.
to an older adult, and he was very, high functioning and recently retired from, I think, medicine. And he said, I'm just really excited to have more time because I have so much email and so many photos to sort. And I have a whole like folder, a spam folder that I've just never even looked at. And there could be some mess. And I'm thinking, wow, that's where it's concerning. It's true. There's lots now you have time for, and a spam folder is not where you want to go looking, but every once in a while you might have found something there that shouldn't have, and I was thinking that's so dangerous that as we, some of it is having some time on our hands to either answer the phone or, answer an email that we normally would be like, this looks suspicious, or I'm just going to wait. And I think that's sometimes the best advice is, none of these decisions have to be made right away, even if the scammer claims that. And I think that's kind of the most convincing scam that I've seen with older adults is the one where it's like you're going to help a grandson or granddaughter who's been in a car accident, who's been arrested, and they're using details that, the person was, on a vacation. And so the grandparent is convinced and will, literally be walking to Western Union to transfer money. And and that's where it's hard to say no. I think it's hard to take a step back and say, okay, well, I'm going to call my granddaughter on her cell phone now and just see if she answers. That's, in retrospect, people are like, yeah, why didn't I do that?
Yeah.
That would have been a great idea. But we're just so emotionally tied to this sort of goal-driven behavior.
That's so interesting. I think we could talk for hours about this stuff, and it just fascinates me the way the human mind works and our emotions work. And
Yeah, I think it's such it's sadly an irresistible problem. And I think, again, from a psychological standpoint, I'm interested in the principles that guide it. And there's, I think, a few core ones that we've talked about. But there's always a variation on it. So I really think these scammers are reading the literature or keeping up, or at least keeping up to date on current events.
mhm.
Student loans, let's go after that. Or, there's going to be voter registration. That's going to be the next thing that's going to be hot in a couple months. And it captures people's interest and curiosity.
Yeah, definitely. I'm 100% positive that current events very much play into scammers. It's just the hook to get you in the door, and then once you get in the door, the scam continues the same. But it's that thing that is current and present, and you're like, oh, I wanted to know more about
Mhm.
whatever the subject was.
Yeah.
If people want to find you online, where can they find you?
I'm a professor at UCLA, so I have a faculty webpage. I have a book called Better with Age, The Psychology of Successful Aging, which tries to address some of the topics we talked about today. How to keep your brain sharp, how to stay active, and those are the kind of the areas of interest that I have. So feel free to reach out.
And can people get a hold of you on LinkedIn?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. I think you can find my email address at UCLA, and I've done some expert testimony. So I'm interested in helping people and organizations stay active, stay healthy, and avoid these sorts of scams and fraud.
Great. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks, Chris. It's been a pleasure.